Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Eden Road podcast, where on today's show, we're going to be looking back at the whole 2023-24 season, dissecting the good and the bad, and also looking ahead to what we can expect from next year. To walk us through the season and help with the review, I'm delighted to welcome back the Athletics Brentford correspondent for the season just gone and long-time friend of the podcast, Jay Harris. Jay, first of all, mate, congrats on the new role covering Spurs next season. Hope all's well with you, mate.
All's really good. Yeah, thanks for having me on. Really looking forward to looking back on this season, but probably 3 years covering Brentford as well. We'll be sad to not be at the G-Tech every week next season, but I'll still keep an eye on Brentford from afar. And yeah, I'm trying to even think if I can remember everything that happened this season. There were so many ups, so many downs, especially the downs. I feel like I've compartmentalized them in a deep, dark part of my brain. So I'll have to try and fish them back out.
I was going to say, because you're going to be covering Spurs next season, if you got that kind of affinity with the club now, obviously following Brentford for 3 years, it's something that you think you're going to keep an eye on the results and stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously I've had a few questions from people asking me how it's going to work next season. And I'll still cover the club when I can. Like I've kind of made that quite clear. I mean, we're talking on Tuesday morning, and I've already got a piece out on Brentford today about the players they might sign this summer. So the coverage won't stop. It will just be week to week. When there are games on, I'll probably be at Spurs and not at the G-Tech. But I mean, for those that don't know, I live literally a 2-minute walk from the G-Tech. And I think when you cover a club and you get to meet all of the different personalities, and that's obviously includes the head coach, Thomas Frank, the players, the backroom staff, the security guards at the training ground, you become very, very invested. And so it's not a situation where I'm going to say, thanks for 3 years covering Brentford while you're in the Premier League. It was great fun. I'm never going to go back there, because I've made friends, I've made connections. So for that alone, yeah, I've got a very special connection to the club. And also, and there's screenshot proof of this if I have to show people, but my gran said that she's now officially a Brentford fan and that she'll continue to follow Brentford's results, which she's done like over the radio for the last 3 years. She never supported a football team before. So I can't let her down. So there you go.
Good stuff, mate. Good stuff. Just before we get going, guys, remember to drop a comment down below, subscribe to the YouTube and Spotify channels, and also give us a follow on our socials. That's at the Elim Road on Twitter and at Elim Road Pod on Instagram. Jay, I thought the best way we do this is to go through the season chronologically, sort of looking back at some of the key moments, digging into those moments, what they meant for the season, etc. And we've also got some questions from our listeners that we might potentially answer in the first section of the podcast, but if not, we'll definitely get those answered as well. But just before we start recording, you mentioned that we probably should start with the future of Thomas Frank, because it's probably the most kind of newsworthy line from the podcast. The Athletic did a bit of an explainer yesterday about why Frank probably wasn't suited, or at least in the owner's eyes, to the Chelsea job. But I had Thomas Frank in the running order anyway, just because of the Chelsea links, the Bayern links, the United links. I tweeted out about a couple of weeks ago that I'm not really sure. I'm not as certain that he'll stay at the club for as long as I thought he would. Probably just by virtue of the fact that he's been linked with so many of these clubs. So Thomas Frank's future, mate, talk to me about what you think is going to happen.
Well, I think it's happened on quite a few occasions over the last 3 years where he seems to be linked to a job. We hear whispers of interest, but we're never really too sure how far it goes. The closest he ever came to leaving was back in just before the World Cup in 2022. When Aston Villa sacked Gerrard, because Aston Villa were very seriously interested in Thomas Frank. Obviously, they ended up going for Unai Emery. Before this Chelsea situation, that was the closest he'd kind of come to leaving. And it felt like, because of the team's results over the last season, that his stock had unfairly, or maybe fairly, depending on your perspective on it, diminished a little bit. And that maybe the era of Thomas Frank being linked with jobs every week had kind of stopped, and he was just going to be hanging around for the foreseeable future, and that maybe his moment had passed. But then obviously we start hearing whispers about Manchester United, and look, that situation might become live depending on what happens with Erik ten Hag. And then the Chelsea surprise, certainly I was a little bit surprised that Pochettino was that they left by mutual consent. And from what we know, Chelsea's co-sporting directors, so that's Paul Winstanley and Lawrence Stewart, made contact with Thomas Frank's representatives and kind of held talks, but they had reservations over his playing style. I didn't quite think he fit the squad. But when he's being linked with Chelsea, Manchester United, this is a little bit different to when he's been linked with Aston Villa, Southampton, Leicester City in the past. There are very obvious step up in caliber and profile, and you just begin to feel like his time at the club is at some point going to come to an end, and a job will come round where he fits the bill and he decides, I have to take this opportunity. I think when you look at the job he's done over the last 5.5 years, Brentford have probably been very lucky to keep him for as long as they have. I don't quite understand why he doesn't get the plaudits he deserves sometimes. And so I think for him to be entering a 4th season with Brentford, if he is there on the opening game of the season, would be incredible. But then also I did speak to him the day after the final game of the season against Newcastle, and he seemed really relaxed, really relaxed. I didn't get the sense that he was on edge about his future or that he was hiding anything. And, he said he's very aware that the grass is not always greener. So, hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he'll stay at Brentford forever. But it certainly feels like a departure is coming at some point. It might not be tomorrow. It might be in 6 months. It might be in 12 months. But like you said, that era of thinking he'd be around forever is probably sort of over, I guess.
It's good that you mentioned that it's not like the likes of Aston Villa or Leicester anymore. Like the fact that we've had 2 solid links, both reported by yourselves at The Athletic, about Man United and Chelsea. It's just a little bit scary. I remember messaging you and saying this Chelsea one has me worried, but I think you made the good point that I don't know who would want to go into Chelsea right now. It just seems like a bit of a basket case club with all the kind of comings and goings.
Yeah, I think if you're Thomas Frank, you know that the job security you have at Brentford is unparalleled at pretty much any other club, maybe in the world, especially in the Premier League. You can make mistakes and you're going to be given the opportunity to rectify them. You could go to Chelsea and burn your reputation within a few months, which is what happened with Graham Potter. I remember when Graham Potter was appointed, Frank was really positive about it, saying, they've done something different, done something outside the box. They've given a coach with a different background a chance, someone who was not an elite player. And then obviously he didn't row back on those comments when Potter got fired, but you could see he was a lot more wary about that situation, that no matter how high a head coach's stock is, they can be chewed up and spat back out straight away. So I think that would have given him pause for thought anyways. But at the end of the day, Chelsea are in the Europa Conference League. The amount of money they've invested into that squad over the last couple of years, of course, that would be an enticing prospect for anybody.
Just before we move on, I just want to say the last bit. You mentioned that he probably doesn't get the plaudits he deserved, and I think so. The owners at Chelsea cited Frank's playing style as one of the reasons why he wasn't suited to the role. And I've seen this before, especially from this season and maybe the last season, Con, as well. It's almost like Brentford didn't exist before the Premier League days. People forget that we were like the top scorers in the Championship 2 years on the trot, playing possession-based football. It's just a bit strange. Go on.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And also, and it's a point I made in the piece on Maresca, that if Thomas Frank has Ivan Toney, who's a very traditional centre forward, then you're going to play to his strengths and you are going to go direct. We've seen what happened with Burnley and Vincent Kompany this season. Although, less on Kompany, the better. But we saw what happened where they very rigidly stuck to their style of play and they came straight back down. And Brentford knew, Thomas Frank, Phil Giles, everybody knew at the club that they kind of had to make those tweaks in the first season when they got promoted and in the second season as well, and be more defensive. And I think they deserve credit for being pragmatic. And then this season was supposed to be the grand revolution, more ball dominant, and injuries just meant it didn't happen. So I think it's a little bit unfair to say the football he plays is not the most stylistic. Well, it wouldn't be, because he's had to play with a different squad, players of a different quality, and he's adapted and kind of got the absolute most out of them. And I do think a little bit, there's this whole idea that Maresca, similarly to Mikel Arteta, has worked under Pep Guardiola, and that's really intriguing. This Italian coach, he's worked in Parma, worked for Man City's academy, etc. And I just think that, rightly or wrongly, that just sounds a little bit more sexy than Thomas Frank, who's worked in Brentford in the Championship and Brøndby in Denmark. I think that's just, if we're honest, there's a little bit of an element to it. I hope that's not the case, but that's my kind of gut feeling.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. There's definitely a Guardiola effect going on. The fact that Kompany got the job at Bayern as well, there's just and even Arteta to a certain extent, there's definitely a Pep effect you can see kind of taking hold. But yeah, I mean, Thomas Frank, the links over the summer, they've definitely made it. I don't know. Before then, I kind of had it in my head that he's going to stay at the club forever. But I think the links with the big clubs this summer, they've gone some way to kind of me thinking the opposite. But yeah, let's move on. First of all, Joe, I want to go right back to before the season began and ask you what you expected from Brentford for the last season pre-Spurs on the first day.
I felt pretty good. Obviously, David Raya had gone, and Mark Flekken was a little bit of a not an unknown quantity. Obviously, he played in the Bundesliga for quite a few years, but I hadn't really seen that much of him. I felt like this would be the year where Kevin Schade, Keane Lewis Potter would kick on. Was confident Brian Mbeumo would play well. I think the first moment where I felt a little bit of I don't know if hesitation is the right word, but was that final week of that window where I thought, okay, Johan Bakayoko's arriving. This is really exciting. Really talented winger from PSV Eindhoven. You know, the Nico Gonzalez deal didn't work out. The Brennan Johnson deal didn't work out. But the club have pulled a rabbit out of the hat with Bakayoko. And then PSV qualified for the Champions League, and that deal's in tatters. And I completely understand that Neil Maupay's got a really strong connection to the club. But I think to come so close to breaking your club record transfer fee on a really exciting Belgian winger, and to end up with Maupay, who at that time hadn't scored in 14 months, it's a hell of a drop-off. Obviously, Maupay then has contributed massively to the club this season, and it's turned out to be a really, really, really smart deal. But I think the transfer window just ended on a little bit of a flat note. And then over the course of the season, when Rico, as I'm sure we'll get into, when Rico Henry got injured, when Kevin Schade got injured, when Brian Mbeumo got injured, that lack of an extra dynamic option up front was really, really felt. So there was a bit of optimism, but I think the end of the transfer window just dented it slightly.
And would you say that sort of pre-Spurs, the fact that we weren't going to have Ivan Toney, and just coming back to the kind of Thomas Frank stuff as well, I know a lot's been made this season about the malleability of managers and whether it's you go into a club and this is your philosophy and that's how you get the buy-in from the players, or you show that you're able to adapt and that's how you get points in the Premier League. But before the Spurs game, was there a sort of clear plan from the club? We're going to play without Ivan Toney now. This is the way we're going to have to play in terms of having more of the ball and seeing those attacking numbers go up.
Yeah, definitely. I think the idea was going to be Schade or Keane Lewis Potter or Visser on the left, Visser or Schade down the middle, and then Brian Mbeumo on the right. And that's a lot of fun. And it's a real shame that we've not seen enough of that lineup. You know, we saw what they were capable of against Luton in that 5-1 game. And I think you got to remember that towards the end of last season, when firstly Toney missed a few games and then the ban kicked in, you know, Brentford won 3-2 at Tottenham. And Mbeumo and Visser had played really well that game. I think Mbeumo got 2 and Visser got 1. And Mbeumo and Visser had this incredible record where I think at least one of them scored every time Toney wasn't playing. And Brentford were just picking up points and they just kept rolling with it. So I thought, okay, of course, Toney's a miss, but Mbeumo and Visser are proven at this level. Schade, once he gets enough game time, it will click because he's very raw and he just needs that talent to be polished up slightly. And then Keane Lewis Potter, after an injury hit debut season, is probably going to be much better. So I thought it will be fine. It might not be 9th and pushing for Europa Conference League or the Europa League, but there shouldn't be the worries about relegation that everybody's ended up experiencing.
And I think, sort of by all accounts from the first day against Spurs, I think there was definitely cause for optimism. I know, like football fans, you kind of have this idea in your head of what your club can go on to achieve that season. You get to that first game, and although it doesn't tell you the full story, you do get some kind of idea of what you can do. And I know it was Postecoglou's first game as well, and Tottenham went on to go on like an incredible run up until Christmas. But I thought that was a game that could have swung either way, to be honest. And if anything, it was probably in Brentford's favour. Well, I know I'm biased, but
yeah. Well, I remember a lot of people feeling like Brentford had kind of thrown away that game because I think Brentford took the lead twice and Tottenham equalised both times. And there was a sense of, Tottenham were there for the taking. But then Tottenham won 8 out of their first 10 games. And you suddenly look back and think, okay, we probably played them at the perfect time. And actually, in hindsight, that's a really good result. So wasn't too stressed by that performance. It took until a few weeks or a couple of months into the season before I think everybody started having everybody started having nightmares about what was to come.
Yeah, all right. Well, let's fast forward a little bit then. I'm going to sort of fast forward past the kind of inconsequential results and go to some runs that had some real ramifications. So we'll go past the Fulham win, although that was probably for many the highlight of the season. Kind of just showcases how bad of a season it was that a highlight was on the second weekend of the season. But I want to talk about the Palace game at home in particular because it was arguably one of our strongest lineups of the year. 4 at the back, Henry and Hickey both fit. Front 3, like you just mentioned, of Brian, Wiss, and Sharda. But I want to speak about Kevin Sharda in particular shortly, because after that amazing goal against Palace, I can't remember which game I think he got injured, but I think it was against Newcastle.
It was Everton.
Everton at home. Was it in the warm-up as well?
Yeah, I remember watching
it.
Right.
Right. Okay. So could you just run us through what kind of injury he sustained and obviously the effect it had on his season?
I shouldn't laugh, but when a situation's so ridiculous, you can't help it. So basically, everybody was finishing the warm-up, and I think it was really only the strikers that were still left out on the pitch, taking a couple of shots just before they go in, like always. And I think Sharda takes a shot with his left foot and instantly falls over on the floor in pain. And you're thinking, okay, that doesn't look great. Worst case scenario, he's not going to be able to start. But it didn't look horrendous. And the next thing you know, he ends up missing 6 months. It was just a really, I don't know if it just must be, extremely unfortunate that he just happened to, I think it was his adductor that he hurt as he just kind of dragged this shot with his left foot. And that was a real blow. Obviously, that goal he scored against Crystal Palace was really good, although we should probably caveat it that it was against Joel Ward, who's a bit of a veteran fullback. So Sharda should be doing that week in, week out to players like that. And I think that's what I'd like to see from him this season. But yeah, Sharda, that was a real shame. We obviously kind of moved over the Fulham result, but also Josh Da Silva pulled his hamstring in that game, and that looked really painful at the time. I remember thinking, okay, he's going to be out for a while. You could see immediately he'd done a lot of damage. So by, the middle of October, you've lost a couple of really dynamic players in Sharda, Da Silva. I think Rico Henry had been injured at this point as well. You then lose 3-1 to Everton. You're thinking, the margins are kind of falling Brentford's way this season.
Just before we move, I do want to talk about Rico Henry because I think for me that's kind of the seminal point of the season. But just on Kevin Sharda quickly, whenever I've watched him, I always think back to the goal against, I think, Man City at home last day of the season last year, when he kind of burns. I can't remember who it was down the left, but he burns someone.
Gomez.
Yeah,
is it Gomez? Sergio Gomez or something like that? Someone that never plays for City.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, their squad that day was questionable, but they just won the league anyway. But just on Sharda, I think about those moments when he skins his man and he's got that blistering pace. He's so raw. He was in the Germany squad at one point last year as well. Just how important could he be? Because I feel like that goal against Palace was probably just when we were seeing him start to get into his groove, and then he obviously gets the injury, which puts him out for 6 months. But it's almost like we haven't seen enough of him. He's not had a kind of sustained run in the team where he started or played well. How big of a player can he be for Brentford, do you think?
Yeah, I think he's the player who possesses the raw attributes to be the club's next talisman, to kind of replace the hole that we all expect Ivan Toney to leave at some point this summer. I think even the fact that he's adopted Lloyd Owusu's celebration and done it twice now, just that kind of instant interaction and engagement with the fans, I think is really important for players. He was very much seen by the club as a bit of a project player because his speed is frightening. But in the final third, in terms of his crossing, his shooting, they're all areas, the technical elements of his game that he needs to work on. So it's just about, can you kind of package that up so in those moments he looks a lot calmer, a lot smoother with it. I think my biggest criticism with Sharda is that sometimes he moves too quickly for his own good, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. It's almost like he constantly plays the game at 100 miles per hour, and sometimes he needs to slow it down and know when to run past somebody and when to just recycle the ball and keep it moving. But he's a player that, I'm sure the fans were gutted that he didn't play too much last season, because I just think it's that classic phrase. That's who you buy a ticket to go and see, right? Someone where he might be quiet for 89 minutes of a game, and then he's going to go on one mazy run, and everybody stands on their feet and is clapping and applauding. And I hope that with a good preseason, that this will be the year where he can really kick on.
It's a fantastic attribute to have, and I don't want to focus just on it solely on his pace, because it might do a disservice to the player overall. But like, to have the kind of pace that he does, there's often times where I've been watching him and it's just like, I just want him to just knock it past him and run, because I know that he's got the burners to do it, but it's obviously not the right decision to make in certain times. But yeah, I hope he does have a good season for us. Let's move on to Newcastle, which for me, I think we did a pod straight after Newcastle, because I thought it was going to be quite an important point of the season, having because Rico Henry got injured up there. But just on the game, first of all, I think it was like I think a draw would have been very much a fair result. I remember there was a bit of controversy with the penalty, and something that Anthony Gordon's become quite adept at in terms of leaving his foot in. He's actually really good at that little trick. He does it quite a bit. But I thought it was a draw. A draw would have been a fair result. But obviously Rico Henry sustains an ACL injury. And I think, for me, I think a lot of people have said, or people on the pod have said before, that Brian Mbeumo's injury at Brighton was maybe the most important moment of our season, because that's when it was just everything fell apart a little bit. But I think losing Rico Henry and then Aaron Hickey in such a short space of time, for me, I think that was the most important moment of the season. But yeah, Rico Henry's injury is the second time he's done his ACL, I think.
Yeah, different knees, which is crucial to point out. I think the Newcastle game was big for 3 different reasons. Firstly, Rico Henry, massive loss. Incredible in 1v1 defensive situations, incredible speed going forward. And who knows if he'd be in this England squad for the Euros if he hadn't got injured. I think that's a real shame. And I think we've all realised that even though he's probably quite quiet on and off the pitch, he's got a very big personality on the pitch, and he's definitely one of the most important players that Brentford have. And the second part is just the whole decision with the penalty. Was it a penalty? Was it not a penalty? By that point, we were only in September, and we probably didn't realise quite how much VAR and contentious decisions around VAR would kind of dominate the season, not just for Brentford, but for other clubs. And that was kind of like the first moment where something had happened and no one really quite knew what had gone on. And then finally, the third point was people were already quite nervous about Mark Flekken. I didn't go to a couple of the pre-season games, but I remember getting messages from people a year ago saying, "Oh, Flecken's looking shaky in the summer series," and I'm thinking, give the guy a chance, you know. But I think whether that was a penalty or wasn't a penalty, I remember the kind of noise around Flekken really not starting the season particularly strongly was kind of amplified by that incident as well. And so it just felt like there were quite a few different narratives that kind of all kind of coalesced into one, which kind of just completely ruined the mood.
Let's move on. I do want to talk about Flekken in some depth, but you're right. I think that Newcastle game for sure. Not for me, to be fair, not even the penalty itself, but there was the goal that got disallowed by VAR. Where he kind of just comes out in his box and just flaps at the ball. I think maybe like 10 minutes before. That was not very convincing, and I think we've spoken about it on the pod. One of the biggest differences between him and David Raya is maybe his control of the box. But I do want to talk about Flekken in a bit more detail, so we'll carry on. Let's move past what I would say. Probably, I think for many, and many would say as well, the first poor performance of the season at home against Everton. We'll go past that because I think that was just a poor day at the office. And we'll go forward to the Forest and Man United games. Probably the first time, Jay, I think I saw and fans saw the fragility of the team without some of the key players. 30 points dropped from winning positions in the 2023-24 season, more than the first 2 seasons combined. Forest were down to 10. We were 1-0 up against Man United until the 92nd minute or something stupid like that. What was it about this team that made them so susceptible to throwing leads away?
Well, I think the extra context with the Man United game is that it was Thomas Strakosha's first game for Brentford. I think Mark Flekken missed it with appendicitis. So there was always some bizarre situation that was happening to Brentford on a week-by-week basis this season, and that was just another one of them. So whether it's a lack of communication in those final few minutes at Manchester United, but obviously when Thomas Frank has to change the defence every week when he's got to play Yano at left back, when he's got to play Godos at right back. When one week it's Ben Mee and Ethan Pinnock, and the next week it's Nathan Collins and Ethan Pinnock, and then the week after that it's Nathan Collins and Ben Mee. You just have to change things slightly. Pinnock, we know, is probably the quickest centre-back unless you play Christopher Ajer there. So if you're playing Ben Mee and Nathan Collins as the two centre-backs, it's a little bit slower. They've maybe got to drop off a little bit deeper. All these kind of tiny things will impact key moments in a game. And I remember with the Man United situation, I won't name who they were, but there were a couple of members of the coaching staff and the analysts who were in the press box that day. And I've never seen them so gutted. Never seen them so gutted. And I've spoken to other people at the club who talk about that game as well. And they say they've never felt so low, because it just felt like Man United got an absolute get out of jail card. They really didn't deserve to win that game. The fact that Man United have earned 4 points against Brentford this season just baffles me. They should have earned none, really. And it was tough. And I think that was a real blow to morale. But then also to even go to Old Trafford, regardless of the stock of Manchester United at the moment, to go to Old Trafford and play that way is still, they should have still taken a lot of credit from that.
For sure. Just, I want to talk about Aaron Hickey as well, because I think he got injured at United. I'm right in saying maybe.
I think he played, if I remember correctly, he played the game the final week of October against Chelsea at Stamford Bridge. Then got injured in training before the West Ham United game the first week of November. I think that's the timeline.
So similar question to Aaron Hickey about what I asked you about Sharda. What's the nature of his injury and the effect on his season? I mean, he's not made an appearance since that game.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hamstring injury. I don't know exactly what grade it is, but it's clearly quite bad because it required surgery and then he suffered a setback on it. Obviously, I think by the final few weeks of the season, he was back running on the grass, but he's not going to the Euros with Scotland, which is a shame for him, but it's probably the right decision for him, and just got to hope that he's fully ready in time for pre-season. But he's been a massive miss, and that's kind of, you know, the injuries have been a massive factor in Brentford's season. But if you look at some of the players Brentford have signed since they got promoted, the availability of these players hasn't been amazing. You know, Christopher Ajer, who I think at times this season's played the best we've ever seen him, but then he'll get injured, whether it's a broken nose, and that's quite unfortunate, or it's his hamstring, or it's his knee, or it's his foot. Something will pop up. We know Damsgaard's had his injury issues. Now we've got Hickey, Sharda, etc. Whether it's down to bad luck or whether it's something that needs a little bit of investigating, the availability of players that Brentford signed in the last 3 years is definitely something that needs to be looked at.
Well, I think they did make a decision. The head of sports science left, and I think they were advertising for it. I think you might have touched on it in your piece, maybe.
Yeah, so they've obviously been conducting this investigation, and they're still doing the investigation or internal review. Investigation sounds very serious. I think they refer to it as an internal review on how to improve things. And I think the main thing they're looking at is how can they get players back quicker. Because Sharda was out for 6 months. De Silva was out for a really, really long time. Obviously, Damsgaard was out for a while after having keyhole surgery. So I think that's the thing they're looking back on. Can we kind of reduce the recovery time? Because a lot of the injuries this season have been contact, and that's just bad luck. You look at Ethan Pinnock's injury against Wolves. He's just on the receiving end of a bad tackle, and he's out for 2 months. Same with Ben Mee against West Ham United. There's not too much you can do about those injuries happening, but can you just be a little bit slicker and smarter with the recovery process? Yeah.
We'll get onto the Ethan's injury as well, but first I want to go through the 3 wins, but also on the topic of VAR, do you remember that penalty shout when Wissa got absolutely wiped out by Matt Turner at Forest? That was insane. I couldn't believe that when I watched it back, and they just skipped past it. No, it was didn't even go to the screen.
Yeah. I do think that PGMOL, I can't remember who does it exactly, but the key incidents from a game get reviewed every week, and then it gets sent out to clubs. And I believe that that was clarified as that was a mistake. And as a fun little fact, I think it was also clarified that Onyeka should have been sent off against Sheffield United. I don't know if people can remember that tackle he made.
That was terrible.
So yeah.
No, we got away with one. We should have done a tweet after that game, mate. That would have been funny. Should have considered our options. 3 wins on the bounce in late October to early November against Chelsea, Burnley, and West Ham. That was actually a really probably the most enjoyable moment of the season for me. But Neil Maupay bags his first goal back in a Brentford shirt against West Ham. We've already touched on him sort of slightly already, but I got a couple of questions. What do you make of him as a player, and how do you think he's done this season?
He definitely had a bigger impact than I expected him to have.
Because you hadn't really seen him, because obviously he played for us in the Championship. So like presumably the only version you'd seen in person of Neil Maupay is the Premier League, Everton, Brighton version.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the fact he hadn't scored in 14 months, and like I said, the fact that his arrival coincided with not signing Johan Bakayoko, it just felt like a little bit of a little bit disappointing, I think it's fair to say. But fair play to him, because he's contributed massively this season. And I think, again, it's not just about what he's done on the pitch, also about what he's done off the pitch, like with the work he's done with the Brentford Penguins, for example. And I think that things like that really endear somebody to a fan base, really connects him with the community, and obviously his goodbye message as well. The goal he scored against Nottingham Forest, the volley, we all remember it as Ivan Toney's comeback game, but actually, Maupay is the one who scores the winner in that game. It's a fantastic goal. So I do like him. I just think sometimes, by the way, I have full respect for what he does on a football pitch in terms of shithousery. I have absolutely no problem with that. When I play Sunday League football, I'm definitely not on that level, but I've got teammates that do things like that, and I might say the odd phrase to try and wind somebody up. I think my issue is that sometimes Maupay's shithousery impacts his teammates, and then it kind of just disrupts the flow of the entire game. And I always look back to that Aston Villa game when Ben Mee got sent off. Aston Villa go 2-1 up, and you've kind of got to use every single second that you can. And Maupay just gets involved in this silly back and forth with Martinez. And at that point, what you're doing is more detrimental to your team than it is helping your team. I think in the Spurs game, when he, rattled James Maddison with a dart celebration, I think for a while that worked. And then the stadium just became so angry, and the team became so angry against Maupay that, I doubt Postecoglou even gave a halftime team talk. He certainly didn't need to. Do you get what I mean? Just wipe the smile off Maupay's face. So I think there are times when his approach to game management, shall we say, is useful, but I think a lot of the time it ends up being a bit of a distraction. And there was a video on Sky Sports' YouTube channel a couple of weeks ago with Neil Maupay and Thomas Frank, and I think they both kind of admit in that Thomas Frank has kind of told him, I get why you do this, but I'd like you to tone it down. So the fact that his head coach is saying that means it's clearly a view that other people hold as well.
100%. I think those 3 games, the Chelsea, Burnley, and West Ham game, I want to touch on a little bit you spoke about in your long read with Frank post-season. When he says the attacking statistics in the first sort of section of the season were all up, but the injuries made that hard to sustain. And I feel like against Burnley and West Ham, we did see a Brentford side that had obviously come off the back of 2 really horrible results the horrible result against Man United and disappointing result against Forest. But those 3 games, I thought, really typified what Brentford could be about. We were gritty against Chelsea, soaked up all that pressure, didn't really let them in. And that was a fantastic game for Ethan Pinnock and Nathan Collins as well, who I think we should touch on a bit later on. But the Burnley game, I thought, whilst Burnley were really poor, we were really quite brilliant in attack, and we were ruthless, especially Brian and Bumo and Neil Maupay as well. And against West Ham, although we let them back into the game and they went 2-1 up, I didn't think that was a game where West Ham would be going 2-1 up. It was almost like they went 2-1 up and then they just sat back and were waiting for us to score. But just on those comments from Frank, do you kind of get an idea that he also feels like the injuries are just that you can't really contend with, you can't really prepare for the injuries that we've had and the nature of injuries that we've had?
I think the only thing you could criticize the club for in terms of the injury situation this season is that they essentially went into the season with Rico Henry at left back, Aaron Hickey at right back, Mads Roerslev and Christopher Ayer can sometimes play right back. So you're clearly deficient in left back, because if Rico Henry gets injured, you're just going to move Aaron Hickey over there. Yes, it works, but it's a bit of a cheat code, really. And I think when your players have great injury records and they're available all the time, that makes perfect sense. You're saving a little bit of salary space, which is important. But then when you have a season like this one where everybody's getting injured all the time, suddenly trying to cut a corner like that kind of ends up, biting you and catching up with you, because you then have to play Saman Ghoddos at left back. And I think Saman Ghoddos played tremendously this season when he was there. Of course, he was caught out and exposed sometimes because he's playing out of position. Did make me laugh that on the final game of the season, he ended up as left centre-back. I think he has officially now played every position for Brentford. But, Ghoddos, it's a wonderful story. But this time last year, he'd been released by the club. Mm-hmm. And suddenly you've signed him to a new one-year deal. And somebody who 4 years ago you signed as a central attacking midfielder is now playing left back against Michael Elise on New Year's Day or the 30th of December or whatever it was. And Elise is running the show. So I think that was, that's kind of one of my issues. But that spell, certainly there were a few things that were really positive. Like you said, I think Nathan Collins was playing pretty well at that point in time. And Mbeumo and Wissa were kind of doing what they needed to up top. But also Burnley were just quite bad. And Thomas Frank's got a strangely good record against David Moyes and a strangely bad one against Sean Dyche. Moyes is just one of those managers Thomas Frank seems to know how to beat. But I think the Chelsea game for me was a real highlight because what's that, 3 years in a row now that Brentford have beaten Chelsea at Stamford Bridge. So that period of time was definitely one of the highlights of the season.
I think from late October to early December, I would say the performances remained largely positive. I know that started off with a 3-0 loss to Liverpool, but I think that was actually a good performance up at Liverpool. And I don't think 3-0 was a fair result, to be honest. And then obviously the late Kai Havertz goal in a 1-0 loss to Arsenal, that's fair. Arsenal would go on to be the main challengers to Man City this season. And a 3-1 home win over Luton, which I think was comfortable. At that point in the season, after the home win against Luton, I don't think too many of us were worried about relegation being a possibility. But it probably became clear that we weren't going to hit the heights we hit last season with the injuries to Sharda, Henry, Ayer, Hickey, all at the same time. But I think Craig has said on the podcast before that the Brian injury at Brighton was the straw that broke the camel's back. And I feel like that was a game that I was watching, and I know that this can happen when you play Brighton, but it was a game I was watching, and it was like they had an extra man on the pitch. It was just insane. We were chasing shadows the whole game, and as soon as Brian went off, we lost his bit of pace in attack. We lost his press. And it only ended up being 2-1, but in all honesty, it should have been more. I think the XG that Brighton have accumulated against Brentford over the last kind of 3 seasons would just be sky high because they always seem to have 20 chances or so. But yeah, Brian's injury, how big was that?
Massive. He had, I think, 7 goals and 4 assists in his first 15 games of the season. So what's that, 11 direct goal involvements? Obviously, some of them were penalties, but he just seemed to really accept the responsibility of being the main man while Ivan Toney was out, and he seemed to be flourishing with it. That equaliser he scored against Bournemouth was a perfect example of that. The skill under pressure. We've all spoken before about how Mbeumo could be quite not the most clinical in front of goal sometimes, but he'd clearly taken a level up at the beginning of the season, and he was one of the most informed and exciting players in the Premier League at that point in time. And so to roll his ankle the way he did and be out for 3 months, and also from his personal perspective, to miss out on representing Cameroon at AFCON was a massive shame. And it just meant that Brentford kind of struggled through, that 3-4 week period before Ivan Toney came back with Yohan Wissa, Neil Maupay, and Keane Lewis-Potter. And again, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about Keane Lewis-Potter. But Keane Lewis-Potter's played at left wing back, striker, and Mbeumo's injury then impacts on Keane Lewis-Potter's development, because Keane Lewis-Potter's got to become an unorthodox centre forward, and he did well for a couple of games, scored against Crystal Palace, but it just meant that there were so many square pegs in round holes. That star quality had gone, and you could definitely see that the team were a little bit demoralised after he went off, and you could see immediately that what he'd done was going to be quite serious. And I think I put Rico Henry's injury as the turning point of the season more, because it almost foreshadowed what was to come. It was like, wow, this is the beginning of the injury crisis.
Beginning of the end.
Yeah, the beginning of the end. But you could also easily say that actually it was in Mbeumo's, just because, I think even Thomas Frank has said that those couple of weeks after Mbeumo got injured, when it was, lots of games coming up over the busy Christmas period, etc., was a real slog, basically.
So you mentioned those games. I think I've added this up right, but I think it was after Luton we'd go on a run that saw us pick up 7 points from a possible 51. And I think I've totted that up right. And that included a 1-0 loss away to Sheffield United, which is the game that Onyeka should have been sent off for. That was a really low moment in the season. That was a terrible game of football. I'm so pissed off I actually went to that. But that was a precursor to losses against Villa, which was quite eventful in and of itself. I thought we could maybe touch on the Ollie Watkins stuff, but I think we've done that. We've kind of rinsed that narrative. And then a hammering at home against Wolves, in which we saw Nathan Collins give away 2 goals against his former club. Forgot which club that he signed for. And then another particularly poor performance at Palace. It did coincide, and I know you mentioned KLP there, with his kind of sustained run in the team. But like you mentioned, as a result of Brian's injury at Brighton and Wissa being away at AFCON. But as you mentioned, he was playing at left wing back. I'm sure he played at right wing back at some point, playing at centre forward as well. I know you're a massive fan of KLP because I always see you tweeting about him. So how would you assess his season? How would you assess him as a player? Because I think we've all kind of agreed that when he's played in his position at left wing, he's always been a threat.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the issue is that he doesn't play there enough, and there's different reasons for that. Firstly, he's probably competing in one of the positions in the squad that's got the most depth when everybody's fit, because Schade can play there, Johan Wissa can play there. So he's really got to come up with a lot of end product to kind of nail that starting 11 spot. But I feel bad for him because firstly, and he's spoken about it in interviews with the club, that I don't think we maybe appreciated quite how difficult that first season was for him in terms of the injury. I think he had a bad knee injury, which required surgery. He ended up being out for quite a few months. And also, he was born and raised in Hull. He's come down to London for the first time, and that's going to require a period of adaptation anyways. And he's getting used to new teammates, a new way of playing. He's stepping up to a different league. When he was playing for Hull City in the Championship, he was the main man. Everything kind of went through him. And then all of a sudden, you're stepping up to Brentford in the Premier League, where the physicality's been increased, the pace of the game's been increased. You've got better quality defenders, and you've got to become used to all of that. And I think this season there's been a couple of moments, obviously the goal against Palace, the goal against Luton, where you can see, okay, when he gets the opportunities and he gets the chances, he can do quite well. But I think he probably would also admit that there's been a few times this season where his finishing in front of goal hasn't been great. I can also remember a chance in that Luton game where he probably should score. I'm pretty certain he goes through for a one-on-one with Kaminsky and kind of, I think he even shoots wide. I don't even know if he hits the target. But I think there's a very talented player in there, but it's just he hasn't got the amount of minutes he needs for his development to kind of kick on to that next level, really, which I think is a little bit of a shame.
I think he'll be important next season, though. I do think he'll be important next season. It is tough because, as you mentioned, that position there is quite a lot of depth. Although I hope that we see Wissa next season as more of that lone striker, because I think he's more effective in that position. But he is competing against Schade, and we've already mentioned in this show that Schade's like the person that you go to the football for. He's almost that kind of Said Benrahma type player that you get up and you want to watch because he's got that raw talent. But yeah, let's hope for a good season for KLP. I do want to touch. So we got Ivan's return up next against Forest, which I think is another huge moment in the season. But just before that, we mentioned Mark Flekken not too long ago, and it kind of coincides with Ivan's return, coincided with Flecken's turn in form. I think he has that blinder against Man City, which I think is after the Forest game, maybe a game after the Forest game.
Yeah, it's after Forest.
But just on Mark Flekken, it was we come on the podcast and we wouldn't want to bash him too much, but it was just like there were a lot of games where his errors would lead to goals, and that's just the nature of being a goalkeeper. Like it's one of the most difficult positions, if not the most difficult position on the pitch, because the margin for error is so small, and he wouldn't cover himself in glory a lot. But just the fact that he's been able to turn it around, I think speaks to his character. And it is different. I imagine him in this situation, like coming from a different league, coming to a squad where he doesn't know any of the players and starting off so poorly. And he must some of the comments on social media is just crazy for a footballer nowadays. I just think it must be so shit to know yourself that you've had a bad performance and then have a whole fan base battering you for it. But just the turnaround, speak to me about the turnaround.
Yeah, like you said, there were a couple of incidents in the first 6 months of the season that made you a little bit nervous. And we should firstly point out that he he was replacing David Raya, who had a special place in his fan base's heart because he was part of that promotion-winning squad. David Raya is now the first-choice goalkeeper at Arsenal, who very nearly won the league. So Flekken had a big job on his hands. Raya was guilty of making mistakes as well, especially in his first season. I think maybe we all forgot that a little bit. But I just remember the game against Nottingham Forest where he kind of conceded that bizarre header, which sort of looped over him, and he sort of didn't really try to save it. And I think that's when I thought I was just a bit confused by it. But I could see that on the ball, what he was doing was very good. He was really good at disguising passes out to the centre-backs. Obviously, Raya always had that tactic of going long to Ivan Toney, and Mark Flekken couldn't do that. So the way he was being asked to play was slightly different to David Raya as well, which I think people need to consider. But yeah, there were just a few concerning moments, like I've touched upon, but also, like we've said countless times, I'm sure everybody's bored of it now, but the defense was changing every week. How is he supposed to build meaningful relationships with the back four when there's different personnel in front of him every day? You need to understand what your centre-backs' strengths and weaknesses are, what your full-back strengths and weaknesses are. And if they're rotating from game to game, week to week, it's hard to build any momentum and any consistency and any solidity. You think of that, what was it, the 12-game unbeaten run in the 22-23 season? And the back four was Raya, Henry, me, Pinnock, Hickey. You could name them like that. I couldn't tell you who's got the most minutes for Brentford this season. I'd guess it's Pinnock, Collins, Flekken, and right back and left back. I don't know, Aya, Rurst. I have no idea. And that just kind of gives you a little bit of an insight into how hard that must have been for Flekken when he's adapting to a new league, adapting to a new team, and adapting to different faces every week. But like you said, his performances in the second half of the season have been way, way, way better, giving me much more confidence. The performance against Man City was really good. It's just a shame that it was against Man City. But I still feel like he's waiting for that breakthrough moment at Brentford. I don't think there's been a game yet where he's won Brentford the game. And so if you compare it to David Raya, especially because of the circumstances he replaced Ramsdale in, I don't think the Arsenal fan base warned to him until he makes that save in the penalty shootout against Porto. Because now Arsenal fans can say, wow, Raya's saved us that game. I think Brentford fans still need that moment with Flekken where he pulls off a save in the 91st minute and it means Brentford win 1-0 against Man United or whoever it is. But I'm sure that will come. Every time I speak to people at the club about Flekken, they also say about how nice he is, how personable he is to his teammates, to backroom staff. I don't think he's part of the senior leadership group, but he's definitely seen as someone who brings a lot of experience and a lot of leadership. He's one of the older players in the squad. And so I think we shouldn't ignore that as well, because we don't see that, right? We see Brentford for 90 minutes on a Saturday at 3 p.m. We don't see what goes on during the week. And everybody I've spoken to has consistently said that he's a really good character in that regard as well. So even when things were shaky on the pitch, I'm sure what he offered overall was really important to the squad.